In Chapter 13, we're just doing a little bit more of a deeper explanation of monetary policy, and specifically what we're doing here is trying to get this idea of when the Federal Reserve is intervening using interest rates, what is it trying to do? Like, what does the Federal Reserve want? What are its goals? Well, obviously it wants the economy to be growing and to have lower unemployment levels, but also it does want stable prices, and if anything, this is the Federal Reserve's biggest priority. This is much more of a politically influenced alternative. This is what economists truly do want. So why do interest rates matter for all of this, for any of those goals? Because primarily the fact that interest rates, they influence how much businesses decide to invest in inventories, in hiring future employees. Also in terms of us as consumers, it affects how much we decide to save, how much we decide to spend. And all of these are things that shift the aggregate demand curve. As the interest rate is lowered, it increases or shifts to the right. The aggregate demand curve. Because what's happening here is that consumption goes up, businesses invest more. And that's exactly what we see with, again, the expansionary monetary policy that we talked about in the previous chapter. Expansionary monetary policy means increasing the money supply. So if what the Federal Reserve is doing has any impact on the money supply and it increases it, then it is expansionary policy. And the primary expansionary monetary policy that you'll see is the Federal Reserve purchasing bonds, because they're buying that with newly created money. Newly created money is the higher money supply. And how that looks in terms of the aggregate demand curve is that increasing the money supply lowers interest rates, which increases the aggregate demand curve. And that's what you see right here. Just basically a repeat of what I just said. Lowering the interest rates cause more consumption, more investment, businesses building more inventory, buying more machines, expanding their operations. Also, the government would spend more money because it's cheaper for them to borrow. And also, it would be cheaper for those who live outside the U.S. to borrow, so they probably would buy more as well. Now, this can work in the opposite direction as well. The Federal Reserve could decide to sell bonds in an open market operation. If they sell bonds, then what they do is they collect the cash from the person who's buying it, and then they destroy the cash. And as they destroy the cash, that raises the interest rate. As it raises the interest rate, it lowers the aggregate demand curve. Shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. Again, to give you the visual here. Shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. I'm kind of going through this, I know, a little bit fast, but this is also the last chapter, so I'm sure we're all a little pressed for time. Well, you're more pressed for time than certainly I am. And I'm doing that because primarily if I don't talk about it in this lecture, you won't be responsible for it on the exams necessarily. The quantity theory of money, this was something that was seen in the classical school of economics. What this looked like was MV equals P times Q. And so the idea was that if velocity was held constant and in this case the prices could adjust, right? So if I fix the Q, then there was a direct relationship, the Q being fixed because the long run aggregate supply curve is fixed at a Q. And the velocity might mean the number of times it changes hands. Psychologically and historically, it remains fixed over time. then changing the money supply directly changes prices. And that's exactly what we see in this quantity theory of money. Changing the money, quantity of money, changes the prices. And that's exactly what you see here. Again, the assumptions being that we hold the velocity constant and the Q constant in the long run, so that money changes prices. And over 3 slides, I have just told you what I told you in 1 slide. If velocity and output are not variable, then changing the money supply directly changes the price level. Which means monetary policy would then be ineffective. Since we did not cover these graphs in detail, I'm going to skip over them. You will not be responsible for them, at least for the exam. They are, I think, present in the homework, but you will not see them on the exam. This on the exam. What we see here is that there is at least some evidence that this is in fact true, that the data reveals that it is in fact the case that changing the supply of money does directly change the inflation rate. So there is some value to it. The problem is that the short run looks very different than the long run. And the reason why primarily is that wages and prices are somewhat sticky in the short run, meaning that they don't adjust as quickly as we would expect them to. And so because they're not adjusting as quickly as we would expect to, then we really see this much more in the long run than we do in the short run. Now, where we see this going on a little bit more is with Keynesian theory. So Keynes, born on June 5th, my birthday, he would be the kind of macroeconomist many of you may have known even before you took this course. He's widely credited as having the economic theories that helped end the Great Depression much sooner, which was essentially the government has a duty to stimulate the economy when the economy is not doing well in the short run, right? And that would mean even if it means the government spending more than it's taking in. And that's exactly what you see here. You know, that it's still what many people practice, and certainly was practiced even in the 2009 crisis. But then you can get this problem, which is kind of what we have right now. A little bit is a bit of a liquidity trap, meaning that even as we expand the money supply, we're not necessarily seeing that change in the interest rates, which would mean then that the monetary policy, the expansionary aspects of monetary policy become less effective. They don't actually stimulate the economy and shift the aggregate demand curve. So Keynes was very strong, certainly during the Great Depression and immediately after World War II, but the challenger to Keynes was Milton Friedman. And Friedman was, so Keynes is a little bit more liberal, democratic. Friedman was much more conservative, Republican. And basically he said, yes, Keynes, you know, fiscal policy can help stimulate the economy, but there is a fair amount of crowding out. And the idea is that even if the government were to temporarily increase my income by giving me a job or just giving me money, that's not going to be the sole determinant of how much I as an individual decide to spend. That I actually care about what my overall income level is going to be over my entire lifetime. That I actually care about my overall wealth levels, and that this is going to affect much more my spending patterns. Friedman wrote the seminal text, Monetary History of the U.S. I'm actually doing a little bit of a project on this right now. Basically, his belief was in monetarism, that the monetary policy can be effective in the short run, but in the long run, really what you see is an interventionist type of Federal Reserve actually just causes inflation, which is the thing that they're exactly trying to avoid. So basically, this is much more of Friedman's pushing for a little bit more of a curtailed or reduced role for intervention by the Federal Reserve or even by the federal government. Again, let's skip this graph just because we didn't really talk about these in greater detail. So when we look at monetary policy then, we need to also look at then what is it going to focus on? Is it going to focus on the price level, something that I said that generally economists think should be the top priority? Or are they going to focus on income levels? Are they going to focus on output and related to output the employment/unemployment levels? Or are they going to be responding to shocks to the economy, like a tsunami, right? And then they have to change policy, or like September 11th, they intervene and they, change their policy because they think that the economy is going to be affected. Or in this case, we could have the demand shock that comes from the housing crisis and the housing bubble. We could see supply shocks as well. The 1970s oil crisis would be one example, or we could see that would be like a resource cost, a dramatic increase in oil, or you could see it like a dramatic increase in labor costs, for instance, lots of different types of things. Where again, the idea of the shocks is that one of the curves is affected, and then the Federal Reserve intervenes to offset that reduction. The general belief of most economists is that, again, price stability is the primary important item in the long run, but that in the short run you can talk a little bit about employment levels, unemployment levels, GDP levels, but in the long run the only thing they really need to focus on is the price stability. Okay. When we look at how monetary policy looks then today, what we're seeing is a great deal of quantitative easing, expansionary monetary policy that is incredibly expansionary, and the concern again of economists is that it can't get much more expansionary than it already is. So related to that then, the concern is that what happens when the economy starts to falter or the economy starts to slow down. They don't have any other tools left to stimulate the economy. We're not really seeing this. We're not really seeing restrictive monetary policy. You would see this if inflation actually had started to occur. Back in 2011, this was what the thought was going to be of what was going to happen by this time. It hasn't happened yet. So the thought was that we were actually going to have to be much more restrictive than we actually are today. So how then should the Federal Reserve act? Should it have a rule, or should it be allowed to kind of operate at its own discretion, kind of decide what it wants to do based on conditions? Well, Friedman basically said that we should have a rule, that basically policymakers should follow that rule, that the rule would be something like inflation should be X, right, or that unemployment level should be Y, and then they'll do everything to make sure that that rule is followed. And again, the popular one is inflation targeting, which almost all central banks follow, with the notable exception being the Federal Reserve does not have an explicit inflation target. Canada, though, has one. Australia has one. Japan has one. The European Union has one. The closest thing that the Federal Reserve has to a rule is the Taylor rule. John Taylor, still alive, over at Stanford, basically then created a rule for how the federal funds target rate or the interest rate should be set. And it basically would be given right here. The inflation gap being the gap between what it would be in the long run versus what it currently is. The output gap being the long run output levels versus what it currently is. And if you look in the book, you can kind of see these kinds of examples here. But